Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good midday, depending on where in the world you're joining us. My name is Colleen Sorto, and I'm the Director of Development Partnerships here at Conservation International. It's a pleasure to welcome you, and even more exciting to be celebrating the almost completion of this task in this phase of ABCG2 for the Freshwater and Wash Task Group, and to have Dr. Peter Apell here in person, who has become my best friend on Skype over all of these years of working together.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's really a nice treat. I am actually going to pass it to Rebecca Goodman, who is Huggins. Goodman.
Yeah.
Okay.
You got it right.
Okay. Who is going to give us an overview of ABCG before we get into the task and talking about what we've learned over the past couple of years.
Okay, thank you, Colleen. Now it's my turn to get this to work correctly. Okay, so I'm just going to say a little bit about the African Biodiversity Collaborative Group. Who we are. We are a community of conservation practitioners who work together to share our experiences and translate our knowledge into tools and approaches to identify and apply those tools towards high priority conservation challenges in Africa, and to inform policy and integrate biodiversity conservation into international development agendas. Our core members are these organizations: the African Wildlife Foundation, Conservation International, who are our hosts today, the Jane Goodall Institute, the Nature Conservancy, the Wildlife Conservation Society, the World Resources Institute, and the World Wildlife Fund. Our aim is to increase our collective impact as a group of 7 organizations with our local partners. And we do that by advancing understanding of critical biodiversity challenges and their solutions in sub-Saharan Africa. During this current phase, we're working towards that mission in terms of 5 thematic foci, and they are land and resource human rights, land use management, managing global change impacts on biodiversity, which looks at the human responses to climate adaptation and how those responses are affecting biodiversity, global health linkages to biodiversity conservation, which is split into 2 areas where we'll focus today on freshwater conservation and wash, and then PHE, population health and environment. And finally, we have a 5th area called emerging issues, which implements a small grants mechanism to target pilot sites and kind of term-limited 1-year projects on a rotating basis. We're working on an integrated approach where we're identifying knowledge gaps, working together to produce knowledge to plug those gaps, sharing that with our broader community, which includes everyone on our listserv, which is all of you, and then applying that knowledge and determining where the lessons learned are and how we can, adapt to improve the knowledge and then put it back into the adaptive management cycle where we're testing it in field and getting feedback from our local partners. So that is the approach. In our current phase, we're closing out year 3. We've just been awarded an extension, so we're now looking at a 5-year grant period. That's $8 million from USAID, Africa Bureau, and contributions from its core members, and that will take us to 2020. That's all I'm going to say. You can find out much more online on our website. We have presence on social media, and of course our listserv is probably the best way to find out about events like these, as well as our publications. And we do follow up with the registered participants. So if you have not registered through ABCG, please do that. And we'll be sending this video out as a follow-up. You can always contact me. My email is there. And I also have a counterpart who's based in Nairobi. So if you're ever passing through or if you happen upon an event over there, please feel free to reach out to Evelyn. With that, I think I'm handing it back to Colleen. Before we hear from Peter. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I'm going to just give a quick overview of sort of where our task started when we kicked off these 3 years before we get into the lessons learned from our 2 pilot sites. So this particular task group is a subtask within the global health linkages to biodiversity conservation. And we specifically look at the opportunities to link freshwater conservation and water sanitation and hygiene because of its potential to help protect and restore ecosystems. We are building on work that happened in the previous phase of ABCG when we were just a little emerging issue. And we started by pulling together a white paper that looked at 42 different projects across sub-Saharan Africa that had some element of biodiversity conservation and WASH within it. That white paper called for tools and resources to help implementers. So as a result, this task became more formal, worked with both practitioners from the conservation side and from organizations that were focused on WASH to develop guidelines and a monitoring and evaluation framework for implementers to use to put these types of projects together. And at the same time, just a little plug, we also kept the conversation going through creating a community of practice based in Nairobi with its online arm hanging out in a LinkedIn group to help continue share lessons and acknowledge that there's a lot of practice and work going on, and that through connecting these implementers, we were advancing the effort. If you're interested in the community of practice and are not a member, please see one of us from the task group. We'd be happy to contact you. But today, we're actually focusing on the application of those 2 tools, the guidelines and the M&E framework, which we applied in Uganda and in South Africa. And we're going to be formally launching the report soon. Today is a preview because it's still under the final review from USAID. But today, we're just going to give you a sneak peek of the lessons. And when the report comes out, we encourage you to take the opportunity to read it. Inside, you'll find out some more details or overviews of each of these projects. 2 very different projects, 2 very different landscapes, but amazingly some very similar issues and things that we've encountered. There are also 6 lessons learned that we found at sort of a higher programmatic level on the ground, and which we'll touch into today, as well as the report itself also provides recommendations. If you're online, we'd appreciate if you can mute yourself until we get to the question and answer. And thanks for joining us. It also includes 2 sections that look at recommendations for strengthening the guidelines in the M&E framework, recognizing that we didn't create something perfect from the start and that these experiences can help improve those tools. So getting into the lessons themselves, our first big lesson, which we kind of had a hunch was true, but we learned in practice that WASH was creating incentives for co-benefits for conservation, that starting the dialogue and activities with communities around WASH made it easier or really enabled the opportunity to complete the circle to then say, and your water resources and protecting those water resources in a different way that either project hadn't really experienced before. The second lesson was related to gender and how gender analyses really strengthened our programming and how we designed our work. And in South Africa and Uganda, we did gender analyses in 2 very different ways, but we both found out that a lot of it tied down to decision making and how to really open the door, create more opportunities for women in decision making that we would not have seen without doing a gender analysis, and that it was there were a lot of cultural attitudes, really sort of deeply entrenched beliefs about how men and women use water that we otherwise maybe wouldn't have caught without that step. Our third lesson is related to education campaigns and how that really both fosters sustainability, but also ownership of how these things were connected. We had really different audiences throughout these 3 years. We were discussing sanitation and land use and water resources with herders, with schools, with teachers, with district counselors, with government actors. And we really believe that through actions that came later in the program, that you could see how that linkage is being made. I think in South Africa specifically, working with communities about understanding how the natural springs that they were relying on at times when district taps weren't working, and how the grazing practices that they had and degradation of that land was dirtying their drinking water. We worked with them to help protect and build structures around and restore those native grasses. And by engaging different audiences, it actually inspired the local community next door to build and protect their own. So again, that it's not just about our actions, but also the awareness and how having that specific focus on talking to different audiences can really help foster and underpin the sustainability of actions. Lesson 4 related to monitoring and evaluation. It was challenging, but both programs said that even though it was challenging, they really felt that was essential for impact. And I think this is an area where we have more room to continue to learn and grow, especially on the health front. Both programs had some challenges, especially related to noting changes related to prevalence of waterborne disease in the communities. A lot of us, when we went in, the M&E frameworks that we designed relied on looking to health centers to provide that data, both before and after the intervention. Specifically in South Africa, we found the health centers, if they were staffed, often maybe had a nurse or maybe a health volunteer, and the records that they were keeping were quite poor in an area where people used a lot of traditional remedies to respond to symptoms of waterborne disease. And if they went to that healthcare clinic, if they saw it and if it got noted, maybe there was a record. But sort of responding to that and how we plan and measure and really see that impact is something else that we think is an area for us to keep growing and improving. Our 5th lesson was that decision-making led by communities really helped to promote local policies and to underpin the sustainability of the efforts. I won't go a lot into this one because I think Peter is going to touch on this in examples from Uganda that really call out how, again, some of that early things that we learned from the gender analyses and how do we bring more local voices in, how are we opening dialogue, but then also seeing like where are rules being made and how can we see that then passing into really ultimately ownership by the stewards of these natural resources. And our 6th lesson, flexible funding was an important element for making the impact go farther. Both projects encountered things that they didn't anticipate when starting. Both projects had to add and respond kind of based on sort of community needs as well as just kind of managing this larger mandate of integration. And the Uganda side there was related to infrastructure in schools and starting this conversation about WASH and then saying, well, this is what we need in order to make that happen. And they were able to sort of then look to another source to supplement so that things didn't just sort of collapse, or there were things we didn't lose that buy-in and that engagement, that instead we could continue to invest and go farther. In South Africa, it was related to the data and the volume of data and the things that they were collecting. And they were fortunate enough to find an additional source of funding so that they could add the use of mobile technology to help keep record and document and add these things on. With that sort of overview of the 6 lessons, I just wanted to acknowledge that although I'm standing up here today and my colleagues at CI especially big kudos to Lydia Cardona, who's in the room, led the process of actually documenting things and organizing it into a report, but it was very much a huge thanks and credit to the staff on the ground and in the field who found time between bad time zones and bad connections to contribute to the report, and that also that this wouldn't have been possible without the Africa Bureau and ABCG behind us. So with just acknowledging that this is an effort of many, I'll just say that if you're interested in the report and you're not on the ABCG listserv, you should be. They will absolutely share it out there, but if not, if you think you missed it, feel free to drop me an email and I'd be happy to make sure it makes it into your hands. And with that, I'll actually pass it to Peter. So Peter can get a little more personal and tell us about his impact working on this intersection in Uganda.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Colleen. It's a pleasure being here. It's different this time around. I've always been making presentations way back from Uganda through very dodgy network connections. So we thought it wise that I am here today. I hope it's a lot better, and I'm excited to be here at the CI offices, and thank you everybody for joining. With that old picture of me, that's yeah, that's about 18 years old.
You haven't aged a bit.
Way back in the Congo. But just to dig in a little bit, I'll be talking about the background of our focal area, a little background of how the Goodall Institute got involved in this and what our previous experience was. And then I'll go a little bit into what exactly we did and link that to the lessons that we've learned, most of which have been touched on by Colleen. So right in front of you is a slide that, for those who have been attending most of these talks, are familiar with now. It highlights the landscape in Uganda where the Goodall Institute is focusing. To the left, in green, is pretty much a network of forests, the bigger blocks. The bigger dark green chunks are the central forest reserves, and those little green marks across the landscape, small riparian corridors, riverine forests that exist between the bigger central forest reserve. And this area that we're focusing on is the Northern Albertine Rift, which is one of the most biodiverse areas in Africa, with lots and lots of species, and our focus species at the Goodall Institute is chimpanzees, and that's why our interest is particularly in this landscape. But despite its wealth in biodiversity, it's also greatly facing the challenge of huge deforestation. Over the last couple of years, we've seen an increasing rate of deforestation. These forests are disappearing at an estimated rate of over 3% per annum. And the most hit forests are those outside protected areas. And that's where our concern is, because the forests outside protected areas provide critical corridors for biodiversity, for migration, linking critical populations of endangered species like chimpanzees. And that's one of the driving factors for JGI focusing on those forests. But then there's the challenge. These forests are not afforded the kind of protection that the central forest reserves do have. These forests are within community land. They're small, tiny forests following rivers and streams, cutting through community land. And the community relies on it a lot for their livelihoods and their survival. And so it becomes a bit challenging to protect these forests. And some of the issues that you face in this area, to the left, you'll see on the slide, the chimpanzee with a snare. Because of the size of this forest, they're so tiny. The level of interaction between wildlife and humans is so high, causing a tremendous amount of human-wildlife conflict, which results into things like that. That is a chimpanzee caught by a wire snare. A lot of chimpanzees do not survive this. And the reverse is true. Chimpanzees and other wildlife have been known to attack humans. In the specific focal area where we're working, just because of this high level of interaction, over 7 children in the last 10 years have been attacked, 2 fatally. And so you see the kind of challenge that we're working with. And over 10 chimpanzees have likewise been killed just because of this high level of interaction around riparian corridors. To your right is a picture of what the corridors look like. These are small streams, and communities, like you see the gentleman there, he rely on it for their livelihoods. They use it for collecting water for household use, they use it for bathing, washing, and things like that. And you can see tucked away in the corner there is a cow. Yeah, cattle also use these water sources. So there's a lot of interaction, domestic animals, people. It's a convergence point. And that, for us, is the entry point as well. Because of this convergence, animals need water, people need water, domestic animals need water, wildlife needs water. A lot of these conflicts, like I've highlighted, were taking place around water sources, because most of these water sources are within the forest, like I've just pointed out. And that's what brought into being the application of the strategy of integrating WASH with forest conservation. Another of the challenges more on the human side, which links WASH with conservation in this focal area, is the girl child. The girl child is, unfortunately for us back at home, the most burdened of the children. They do a lot of the home chores, they collect a lot of the water, and so this picture here goes to show, these are girls in school uniform, as you can see, but they're carrying water cans. That's the typical kind of water system that we use for collecting water. And they spend a lot of their time doing this. They don't go to school. And if the girl child doesn't go to school, that means they'll stay home more often. Sometimes they're married off early, and increasing population pressures, which eventually links to conservation. And so, and also back to the previous slide, a lot of these water sources that we're talking about, whenever these girl children especially went to the water sources, because they're girls, they're weak, they're scared, they'll be attacked by chimpanzees, so it was causing a bit of a problem as well. So there's a lot of things happening around these water sources: forest degradation, diminishing habitat, increasing interaction between wildlife and people, diminishing water sources, diminishing water quality, the girl child spending more time around the water sources. And so you see, it provides a very great hotbed for us to anchor the work that we then started doing. And in the time that we were there, over the last 4 years, with support through ABCG, USAID through ABCG, we decided to meet these challenges head on. First and foremost is to create alternative water sources. We built 9 water sources in total. One of them are the water tanks that were set up in schools, and the other are protected springs. What these water sources do, one, like the water tanks in schools, is it takes away the level of interaction. Instead of girls and children going to the forest to fetch water, they can now get it at their schools. And you can see how excited the kids are. This is real concrete excitement, because they walk out of their classroom and the water tank is right there. They do not have to walk another 10 kilometers after school to go and fetch water and then go back home, because it's a requirement. From school, you have to come home with water. Otherwise, yeah, you get punished. And this immediately gives some sort of incentive to the students themselves. But the beauty is that the schools exist within the communities. And that means community members also have access to the same water tanks in schools, reducing the distance between their homesteads and their water collection points. So just by making an investment in building 5 water tanks in strategic locations around villages, we did shift the pressures from the forest to an area where they reduced interaction with wildlife, reduced distance for women and children to go and fetch water, and that was a huge incentive. 2, we also built protected springs, which are much cleaner. We did do an evaluation that indicated that water the community was relying on was very poor in terms of quality, but with the filtration system, added filtration system, cleaner water, the communities are now relying on springs that makes water a lot cleaner. So this was our first lesson, that the interventions that we made created incentives and benefits that directly link conservation with WASH. There were tangible benefits. The communities could see water tanks and they would understand the linkage. Why is this tank here? It's because we want to keep you away from the forest. Why do you want to keep you away from the forest? Because it's dangerous for children to go there. The level of interaction, and so on and so on. And that was real. And and appreciated, very much appreciated by the community. And that was our first lesson, that we have to really devise strategies that address the very socioeconomic needs and fabric of the communities that we work in, for them to make those linkages as apparently as we've learned and two. The other lesson which I'll highlight, one of our greatest shockers, is that we did a gender analysis that provided insight about roles and responsibilities relating to our work in the area. This was done very early before we started, and we learned a few interesting findings. The biggest one for us, this is a typical picture of what water sources back home look like. The gentleman is standing there looking with absolutely no care. I mean, you can interpret it whichever way you want to, but it's the women and children who are fetching the water. This gentleman is not going to even help carry the water. And when we started our work in this respect, we held village meetings where we're challenging the men. Why you're stronger? Why aren't you carrying the jerry cans and the water and things like that? And the explanation that we got from our gender analysis was shocking, that some of these gender issues are actually reinforced by the women themselves. That was one of our biggest findings, that women would also support the men, especially husbands, not to go to the water source, because they're asking, what? If you go to the water source, then you're interacting with other women. Why? Yeah, why are you going? Do you want to go and meet other women at the water source? So the men cannot go and fetch water. So the women would literally stop you, even if you volunteered to go and fetch water. So it became suddenly challenging, but more importantly, it framed our approach, because previously we were assuming, no, just go educate the men on the value of supporting the homestead. But that totally redirected our approach to how we dealt with men and women in regard to roles and responsibilities around WASH. And so that took us into a new direction where we're doing a lot of consultation and trying to tailor our interventions and our approaches to fit within the social cultural framework on the ground, and make it applicable. Otherwise, we'll probably keep on facing challenges. And so far, now as I speak, a few men are fetching water after a lot of sensitization. Not everybody, but a few, you'll find them collecting water and things like that. So there are a few other lessons that we learned, and we can discuss this further as we go along. Community education was another huge lesson. We always know education and awareness opens the mind.
I'm sorry, there's construction upstairs that wasn't supposed to be happening right now. Repeater.
Yeah, education and awareness opens the mind and helps teach people how to behave, changing knowledge, changing attitudes, changing behavior. We did hinge a lot of our work on this because it's the entry point to introduce some of the concepts that we're bringing into the area, but also to help educate the community how to behave or change in behavior that is more applicable to conservation and WASH. And the approach that we used was very broad consultative approach. In the schools, for example, we worked with the teachers to integrate the WASH lessons and WASH messaging into the normal daily lessons presented in class, so that we do not take away time from the normal school curriculum. And this involved broad consultation both with the school teachers within the schools and the district education administration, and drafting posters like those that you see, which we then apply for the standard lessons that are being taught in school. So a math lesson, English lesson, you pick on one of these WASH posters and you still convey the same subject, but with a WASH messaging and language within it. And this has worked quite well, and we're still running and distributing this across not just the schools that we're targeting under the WASH program, but beyond as well. Community-led decision-making, we hear a lot about participation, consultation, and things like that. Under this program, that was core and central to a lot of our work, because a lot like I've mentioned on the gender issue, a lot of the strategies that were applied had to come from the communities. It had to be driven by the community. Here's a rough indication of some forms of consultations. This is a village map on the ground showing where the water sources are, because we had limited resources. For example, placement of water sources. Where do you place the water source? You may think, well, we just distribute them equally across the geographic landscape. No, that's not how it works. You may distribute them equally, but you may not be reaching the number of people that you intend to. So you have to consult with the local leaders, the users themselves, they pinpoint it on the map. We go there, visit the sites together with them, agree, and everybody agrees on where the water source should be. Pinpointing areas where conflict is more extensive, and this is the linkage with conservation. Not all water sources have chimpanzee or baboon or wildlife conflicts, but some of them are more dangerous. So if you make the wrong choice, you may build a water source, an improved water source, at a site which causes more problems, actually. So this community participation and consultation was critical in identifying the sites where we did our work, our education, where we did more education programs and things like that. But beyond that, we realized that Uganda, like many countries, I believe, has a lot of laws and policies that govern things like WASH, that govern things like conservation. But its application on the ground is very limited. It doesn't really trickle down to that rural household. That most of them are not educated. It doesn't trickle down to them. They probably do not even know these policies exist. So working with them, with the communities, and working with the local government through this community-led decision-making process, we decided to set up local bylaws. And right now, as I speak, the bylaws have been passed in Budongo sub-county, which is a geographic area much larger than where the WASH project was focusing. Because the local leadership said we can't just do bylaws for a few villages, 7 villages. No, the bylaws have to cut across, and it's going to be expanded probably. The local government is also carrying this as a lesson for them to learn, but there are bylaws on fines, on use of water sources, garbage disposal, hygiene, latrine presence in your homestead, washing racks and things like that, that cover the entire breadth of WASH, with associated fines and enforcement mechanisms. So as our exit strategy, through this community participation, they set up the rules. We did not come up with anything together. We just told them what is required. They came up with the rules on hygiene, availability of pit latrines. When we started, pit latrine coverage in this area was less than 40%. As we speak right now, unverified sources from the local government put it at about 71%. We'll hopefully be verifying this soon, and that is a significant increase, almost 50%. We have increased latrine coverage in schools from 10% to 100%. We've also increased water access. The figures almost doubled from 50 to almost 80%. So a lot of these achievements have to be carried beyond the close of the project. And the only way that would work is if the decisions are within the hands of the communities. And that is reinforced and captured within the bylaws that have just been passed. Thank you. I'm sure we'll be having a lot more to discuss, and I'm open to questions and comments and feedback. Thank you.
Should we take some questions in the room first and then open up to folks?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should have, apologies that I didn't call this out earlier, but I also really wanted to call out that I can speak on behalf of South Africa, but the great work has been done by my colleagues in Conservation South Africa, who's our local affiliate, working in the Mzimbubu. So who would like to go first?
I have a question. Given that we're nearing the end of this phase funding of ABCG, I'm curious about the maintenance plan in place for the water infrastructure that's put into place through the last couple of years.
Yes, that's always a huge concern. And quite challenging, especially when you're dealing with communities that resource constrained. But very early in the day, and that's why we started the investment in infrastructure at the very first stage. That gave us a lot of time over the next years to monitor on our own and try and make those linkages that work. We set up water user committees. The truth of the matter is they're not 100% functional in our last evaluation. We're up to about 70% functionality, which is okay, judging from the previous experiences. We've had instances where water user committees have been set up and they drop to zero immediately the project ends. But these water user committees were set 3 years ago, and if they're still operational, about 70% of them are still operational. That's fairly okay. And these water user committees are comprised of members of the community, at least 40% women. Our average is about 44%. And they do work with the communities on ensuring the maintenance aspect of the water source. And where does the funding come from for this? Money is collected at household level. That goes towards a kitty that's then used for fixing and maintaining these water sources. The ABCG WASH project is, as you heard from Colleen's presentation, it leveraged funding, the flexible funding from other donors and other supporters. In Uganda, we merged it with other projects. A lot of them working on enterprises and socioeconomic livelihood, which means there's improved household income within the landscapes that we're working in. So part of the revenue that is generated by these households is actually put towards a saving scheme. Some of it is put towards collective community projects like water sources and things like that. So these water user committees are collecting this money. But beyond that, we did identify at village level, for every village where we set up a water source, we identified one community member who was either a carpenter or a mechanic or something, somebody who had some level of skill, and trained him further on maintenance of these water sources. And so they have the presence on the ground within their villages. They don't have to call somebody from a far off place who comes and supports this. We had an instance within, I think, 4 or 5 months of setting up of the water tanks. One of the tanks, actually, the tap broke. And yes, they kept calling us and saying, JGI, the water tank broke. And we kept ignoring them until they fixed it.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And so it's working. It's actually working. And so that's one of the challenges. But we are also working with the local government to try and bring them into the center, because this is their role. They do have the responsibility to ensure functional water sources across the entire geographic landscape. Unfortunately, yes, we understand they're resource constrained, but at least creating that linkage helps them with prioritization. I mean, through this investment, you sort of deflate some funding that they would have otherwise had to invest to channel it to other places. So they should be having at least some little resources left over to support in terms of maintenance and extension. And with due credit to the Masindi local government, we're very happy that the district water office is very engaged. At least we've seen an increased level of engagement with them monitoring these water sources and doing something about it. You know.
That's great. Yeah.
Just briefly on the South African perspective, I mean, we've attached it from that sort of 2 different spheres. One is the government sphere, because our WASH partner was the district government, and kind of Peter alluded to in the Uganda example. They have the mandate, and they're the ones who are supposed to maintain WASH. They're the ones supposed to put in and maintain WASH infrastructure. Through working with them, not only did we discover they're struggling to even reach the level of coverage, but there was also a tremendous backlog of infrastructure that they had put in that was broken. And until they got the other new stuff in, they weren't really addressing the backlog. So part of our efforts were, what can we do with communities to help them respond to sort of being stuck in the middle of that. So we're still working with the government actors, trying to figure out what do you need to reach the capacity to maintain, but then also there were a couple things that we did, especially on sort of that lesson 5 was like really about the community decision making. So one was getting the traditional courts to identify water monitors who were volunteers who received a very small stipend to help protect water sources. We worked with the water monitors to source all local materials to protect the physical cages that are around the springs where people are sometimes either fetching their water directly from, or they've created a gravity-fed pipe system to the village. a lot of those water monitors, we've had gaps in the funding for their stipends, and they've continued to look after the water source, make sure the infrastructure is there. Like I said, part of the reason we did locally sourced stuff was so that if something broke, they knew where and it was available. Another thing which seems small, but we had the communities name their water sources, and our teams took white rocks and spelled out the name of the water source, and that says a lot in terms of like, we own this. This is ours. And one of our reflections working with the CSA team was maybe even in the next phase of ABCG being really thoughtful about sort of what's that long-term sustainability planning beyond even sort of that 5-year tack, because that's what we were starting at, like, how do we get something started and then see it carry on after our funding ends? And I think WASH sustainability, and obviously natural resource management sustainability, is so much larger, and so kind of how we balance that divide is, I think, part of what's in our future as well. Other questions? And if you're online and you want to ask a question, you can also type it in the chat. We are monitoring it.
We do have one online.
Oh, okay.
You got it with that one?
Please.
So Ron Savage has asked if, he says he's curious to know if there's any legal mechanism for registering small watersheds above community water sources that would give some degree of legal protection for these sites.
In Uganda, waterways are protected by law. There are laws that exist that require that a buffer area is maintained around water sources, depending on the size of the river. You require a buffer that ranges from 15 meters on either side to 50 meters on either side. This is the only existing mechanism for protecting of catchment areas on community land. There are other mechanisms that you can apply if you go into setting up communal land associations of critical areas that you feel are important for biodiversity conservation, natural resource management, or catchment management. There are mechanisms in place to do that. I know that the Water Department is working towards developing catchment management plans. They have not yet reached in the area where we're working. They're moving from the south, coming northwards. That could also be another avenue, because these catchment management plans would then put in place some sort of legal mechanisms for management and regulating them. But other than that, those are the only options that I would think. Either a catchment management plan, application of the existing national laws for protection of buffer zones, or some voluntary mechanism where you're working with communities to set up a protected area around catchment areas. Otherwise, specific water sources, no. There's nothing to do with water sources and legal protection.
In South Africa, so I can speak to what I know. I know there are laws at the national level that protect water sources. How they pass down more locally is kind of some of the biggest challenge. But I was just at World Water Week last week in Stockholm, where I went to a session held by several different agencies within the South African government about green and gray infrastructure, and their government platform that really recognizes that nature it has a big hand in protecting our water supply, and that's part of our approach. And there was it was someone from the science and technology part of the government, someone working from SANBI, the South African National Biodiversity Institute. So there's national level awareness. There are catchment governing bodies in the Mzimbubu. It's the Mzimbubu Catchment Partnership Program, the UCPP. CI and Conservation South Africa specifically is one of the actors that's involved in the UCPP. But I think the challenge, especially with our interventions that we had a part of this project, is although we are in the headwaters, we're in the areas where the water is coming from the mountain, natural springs, eventually collecting to much smaller streams, to where those smaller streams go even further down to eventually connecting to the river. So it's sort of like, for that big scale, there's a lot more in place, but how you kind of get that mosaic to go from the tiniest tiles into the biggest ones, it's up to I think the people who live there and what their practices are. So that's kind of what we're trying to respond to.
Upstairs.
Additional questions online or in the room?
Sure. Well, thank you so much both for sharing. It's really wonderful success that you've had. I'm curious if you have visions or intentions about how yourselves or others might scale this kind of approach further. Where might we go from here? How can others adopt this kind of success? I'm sure the report will help guide the way, but let's get this out there even more.
Well, we already, this was one of an approach. When we started, we'd never applied WASH in Uganda, at least, to try and link it to conservation. And it's been, I'll speak for Uganda, one of the most successful strategies that we have applied thus far in terms of what we're seeing, the changes that we're seeing on the ground. And so what we've learned from it, we are applying it across other programs. As we speak right now, this project is coming to a close, but we're carrying on forward, working with the local government, carrying on the aspects that have worked from this project to other landscapes where we're working, but also strengthening further the area where we've worked. We're going beyond. Over the last 4 years, a lot of the work that we did was more towards linked with water and watersheds and not so much on the hygiene side, like Colleen just mentioned, the hygiene and health. So now we're building on that because we really want to make it a fully rounded circle. So we're working on the health and hygiene side. We're working with villages, setting up village health teams that will now start monitoring the health linkage angle through support from other programs. And so we're carrying on with this. We're not walking away from it. The bylaws that have just been set provide that exit strategy to be carried by local government because these bylaws are existing forever. And so local government is now involved much more in issues of water sanitation and hygiene, at least within the landscape that we're working in. So yes, we are carrying on with the work, expanding geographically, strengthening in areas where we felt we had gaps, and yes.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, please.
So with the health piece that's newer, has that opened up new sort of stakeholders that have been interested in your work, or even?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, the funding itself and the support has brought in a totally new partner who, based on the work that we've been doing, WASH, had an interest in building on to the work that we're doing. So that we've got a new partner on board who is doing work, conservation through public health. I don't know whether you're familiar with them. They use a model that tries to use public health as a conduit for conservation. And so they're working at, it's a local NGO. They're working at helping us strengthen the capacity of what they call village health teams, where the health assistants that Colleen mentioned sometimes are non-existent or have little capacity at village level. We're working building their capacity in terms of giving them the tools and training required for them to execute their work at village level. And so there will be the conduit through which a lot of this, like the bylaws, are being channeled, the education messaging that we've developed through ABCG in the last couple of years. When we leave, somebody has to carry on this messaging. It will be the village health teams going household to household, door to door, school to school, carrying this messaging. And so it's a 1 year phase where we're just going to build capacity at local level, village level, for these village health teams to be able to carry on this going forward. So yeah.
Cool.
And I think we can say from the CI perspective, in terms of like, how do we make this bigger and more? CI has a new freshwater strategy in which we have a wash and watersheds component, which is all built around these experiences in South Africa. We're as a part of that, creating a framework for how do you make a wash and watershed sample and then push it to scale. So the last piece of that framework includes, in South Africa, for example, working with the UCPP, that catchment partnership, to say who can replicate and take these parts so that we're not doing it everywhere And then how does that then grow to the level of the watershed? So you're going from source to sea. Like, that's the ambitious vision. But I will say, having worked on this intersection of freshwater conservation and WASH with ABCG and other parts of CI for like 10 years now, scale is like the question that comes up all the time. And I think the organizations that are working most closely in this intersection have to walk before they run. And I think, you know, from CSA's example and the JGI example as well, just that little walk has given Peter so much more confidence that they are ready to run it and bring that beyond. And I think the communities largely feel like, oh, we just need enough proof and then we can all do it. And some of it is like just saying, actually the next step is just try it a little bit. Just try it a little bit and note that change, because I think from these experiences, from the white paper, like I think we've got enough to say, like, there's room for everybody to try it a little bit, and there's a difference to be made. Anybody else on the line before I sort of move us to close, because we're almost at time and the construction hasn't started up again. So maybe that's fine. Thank you everyone for coming out today, for joining online, for continuing to support and be as enthusiastic as we are about this work. We're hoping this is not the end with ABCG, and definitely not in CI or JGI's perspectives. And please join our community of practice so we can keep the dialogue going.
Thank you.
Thank you.